Every empire thinks it's the exception, until it isn't. Every powerful empire believes it will last forever, but history shows the same pattern repeating. And the scariest part is, most empires collapse right after their peak. And that feels almost impossible when you're living inside one, because at the top, everything looks strong. The economy seems stable, the military looks unbeatable, the culture feels dominant, and people start believing their empire is different, smarter, stronger, more advanced, more permanent. But history has a cold message. Power does not collapse only because of outside enemies. It collapses because of predictable patterns. Patterns that grow slowly, hide under success, and explode when the system can no longer carry its own weight. Welcome to FrameHistoro, where we break down the real systems behind history, the quiet forces that build empires, and the hidden mistakes that destroy them. Now imagine waking up in the capital city of the strongest empire on Earth. The streets feel safe, trade is busy, money is moving, and the government looks confident. You would never think collapse is even possible, but collapse rarely announces itself. It starts quietly, first with small problems people ignore, then with bigger problems leaders explain away, and then one day, the empire is shocked that everything fell apart. So today, we're going to explore the warning pattern history keeps repeating, why the biggest empires rise, peak, and then fall, and what signs always show up before the collapse. Because when you understand the pattern, you start seeing history in a completely new way, and you may even start seeing modern life differently too. So let's start with the first part of the pattern, the rise. Almost every empire begins with a simple advantage: strong organization, strong leadership, strong military discipline, or control over a valuable trade route. Rome had disciplined legions and smart roads. The Mongols had speed and coordination. Spain had ocean power and overseas wealth. Britain had naval control and industrial growth. The United States built unmatched production strength and global influence. Every empire begins with something that gives it momentum, and that momentum creates success. Success creates confidence, and confidence creates expansion, and that leads to the next stage of the pattern, the peak. The peak is the most dangerous moment, because the empire starts believing the good times are permanent. It starts spending more, expanding more, and making bigger promises. Leaders feel safe, citizens feel proud, and everyone assumes the system will keep working forever. But here's what history shows. The peak creates blind spots, because success hides weaknesses. When money is flowing, nobody wants to hear warnings. When victories are common, nobody wants to talk about limits. And that is when the empire starts stepping into the trap, because growth becomes expensive, and the system gets heavier. As empires expand, they gain land, people, and resources. But they also gain problems, longer borders to defend, more officials to pay, more corruption risk, more supply needs, more politics to manage, more rivals who feel threatened. Expansion is not free. It is a long-term bill, and this is where the warning pattern begins. Costs start growing faster than strength, and at first, the empire can handle it. But slowly, it becomes harder to pay for everything, and that brings us to the next stage. Financial strain. Even rich empires feel financial strain, because empires don't collapse only when they run out of money. They collapse when their spending grows faster than their ability to support it. Rome is a classic example. Rome built a giant empire, but defending it became incredibly costly. So taxes rose, pressure increased, and trust weakened. Spain is another example. Spain was wealthy at its peak, but it relied too much on silver from the Americas, and spent too much on wars. And when the flow slowed, the system struggled. Britain faced strain too. After huge wars, maintaining global control became expensive, and debt became a constant burden. And this is a key moment in the pattern. When leaders feel pressure, they often choose short-term fixes instead of long-term repairs. They raise taxes, borrow more, or weaken the value of money, and those moves can work for a little while, but they also create long-term damage. Because when you squeeze the economy too hard, you reduce productivity. When you borrow too much, you increase risk. And when you mess with money, you destroy trust. And once trust begins cracking, the empire becomes fragile. Now, we reach one of the most important parts of the warning pattern. Inequality and unfairness grow. During the rise of an empire, people often feel opportunity. They feel like effort is rewarded. They feel like life is improving. But during the late stages, wealth starts concentrating at the top. Elites gain special treatment. The middle class weakens, and ordinary people feel trapped. This happened in Rome when small farmers were crushed and wealthy landowners gained control. It happened in France when the tax system punished common people while powerful groups avoided the burden. And it happened in many empires where corruption turned public service into private profit. And here's the problem: inequality is not only about money, it's about trust. Once people believe the system is unfair, they stop supporting it emotionally. They stop fighting for it. They stop sacrificing for it. And that is when unity breaks, because empires survive on cooperation, not only force. Now, the next stage of the pattern is political decay. When trust drops, politics becomes more extreme, leaders become more desperate, and the government starts focusing on control instead of improvement. Corruption rises because positions become valuable, not for service, but for profit. The empire becomes slower, less flexible, and more focused on protecting itself. And this creates another key problem. The empire loses adaptability. Adaptability is one of the greatest strengths in the early rise, but one of the biggest weaknesses near the end, because early empires are hungry. They innovate, they adjust fast, they take smart risks, but late-stage empires become proud. They resist change. They cling to old systems, even when the world is changing. And this is the stage where rivals begin catching up. Because while the empire is stuck, competitors learn, improve, and grow stronger. And this leads to the next stage: military pressure and overreaction. When empires feel threatened, they often respond the same way: more spending on defense, more wars, more control, more fear of losing power. And this can push the system over the edge, because wars are expensive, and constant conflict drains both money and morale. And even worse, late-stage empires sometimes choose symbolic wars, fights meant to prove strength, instead of wars that actually make the empire safer. And this mistake has destroyed many powerful nations, because it wastes resources while the internal system is weakening. Now, we reach the final stage of the warning pattern: the shock collapse. And here's the part that surprises people. Collapse is usually not one cause. It is many causes stacked together: financial strain, weak trust, unfair rules, political decay, overexpansion, and exhaustion. And then something triggers it: a major defeat, an economic crash, a succession crisis, a civil conflict, a famine, a pandemic, or a powerful outside enemy pushing at the right moment. And suddenly, the empire falls faster than anyone expected. Because once the system is brittle, it does not bend, it snaps. That is why collapse often happens right after the peak. Because the peak is when the empire has the most obligations, the highest spending, the biggest borders, and the strongest belief that it cannot fail. And that combination is dangerous. Now, let's make this simple. What is the warning pattern in one line? Empires rise through strength, but fall through weakness they ignored during success. And here's the deeper lesson: the outside world doesn't have to destroy an empire. Sometimes the empire destroys itself, slowly, through choices that feel small at the time, but add up. Higher taxes to fund higher spending, more debt to avoid hard reforms, more corruption because the system is too big, more inequality because elites capture the benefits, and less trust because ordinary people stop believing in fairness. And once trust is gone, the empire is already in trouble, because trust is the glue holding everything together. Now, let's bring it back to modern life. Not with fear, not with drama, but with honesty. History is not just about nations, it's about patterns of human behavior. And the biggest pattern is this: when people feel safe, they get careless. When leaders feel untouchable, they stop listening. When systems feel permanent, they stop being maintained. and that is when decline begins. So here are a few reflective questions to sit with. What are the signs of a healthy system? Do rules feel fair? Does effort still feel worth it? Do people trust their institutions? Does the economy reward productivity? And does leadership focus on long-term stability, not just short-term wins? Because strong empires, like strong lives, are not built only by power. They are built by discipline, balance, trust, and the ability to adapt. And that is why the warning pattern matters. Not to scare you, but to teach you. Because history is the closest thing we have to a long-term mirror. It shows what happens when success creates arrogance, when growth becomes greed, and when confidence becomes blindness. Every empire thinks it is the exception, until it isn't. And if you learned something new today, take a second to subscribe and explore more documentaries on FrameHistoro, because understanding the past doesn't just make you smarter, it helps you see the present more clearly. Thanks for watching.